I'm gonna break down for you my 3 favorite versions of triangle pose to practice and teach. You'll be able to incorporate these in your practice and in your classes if you're a teacher right away. But before we do this, I want us to know that this conversation is actually much bigger than triangle pose itself. This conversation is really about going beyond the belief that there's a singular way for everyone to do every posture in perpetuity. So also use this work to internally push back against any rigid, singular, ideological, or dogmatic notion that there's only one way to do something, whether it's in a yoga pose or in our life in general. First, my go-to version of triangle pose. This is my default mode triangle pose. And in this version of the posture, we're really focusing on evenness, equanimity. We're lengthening the hamstrings on the front leg, we're lengthening the adductors on the front leg, we're creating nice length through the spine, we're creating nice spinal rotation, we're opening the chest. We're doing all of these things, but everybody, we're not just focused on one thing. In this version of the pose, we're really feeling the symphony of how the whole body moves and works together, instead of focusing on a singular attribute. To do this, I prefer a pretty broad stride. So I start with a warrior 2 position where my front shin is vertical, my pelvis is level with the ground, and my back foot is stepped far enough away from my front foot that I have a good, strong engagement in the posture. I straighten my front leg, and instead of rotating my pelvis away from the front leg, I'm gonna turn my hips a little bit towards my front leg, almost everybody like I'm setting up for warrior 1 instead of triangle pose. Then from here, I rotate my pelvis forward as if I'm going into Trikonasana. So it's gonna feel much more like a forward bend entry than a conventional triangle pose entry. And here's why. For so many students, when you overly laterally rotate the pelvis away from the front leg and then try to tilt the pelvis into triangle pose, it gets stuck. That front hip socket and femur can get a little bit stuck on each other. And we see this when someone starts to go into the pose and they're really locked up. They barely go anywhere and their hand comes to their thigh. Everybody, that's almost never because their hamstrings are tight, although their hamstrings may also be tight. It's because the pelvis is inhibited from laterally tilting when it has overly laterally rotated first. So for all these versions, I want you to experiment with turning the hips towards the front leg to enter the pose. Eventually you will turn that hip up in a more conventional way, but we're not doing it at the onset. First thing that I wanna do as I enter this version is I want my bottom arm to make a nice, strong base. Now, as my bottom arm makes a nice, strong base, that's taking some of the demand out of the front leg. Remember, in this version where we're focusing on evenness, I wanna distribute the weight. So I'm thinking about my bottom arm and my front leg as 2 weight-absorbing pillars. As I do this, I strongly ground through the back leg so I have a triangular base. Not just triangular in shape, but triangular in amount of intensity and demand. I'm rooting down. That hand can go to the floor, that hand can go to the ankle, that hand can go to a block, but that hand or that arm is not cosmetic, it's foundational, it's structural. Also, the more we root down through that bottom arm, the more we can reach up through the top arm, the more we can create this really dynamic ground reaction force. So I'm rooting down through both legs, I'm rooting down through the bottom arm. I'm using that to stretch my top arm up strongly. I'm keeping my bottom waist long, and then I'm nice and slowly turning that top hip and the chest upward just until they stop. I stay here for a few breaths, feeling the feeling of the whole body as one integrated composite. Then after a few breaths, I bend my front knee and I come all the way up, or I transition into a flow. In the second version of triangle pose, we're really focused more on strength. So instead of distributing the weight nice and evenly throughout the whole body, we're gonna load it a little bit more into the front leg, and we're also going to work the top side of our core, especially our obliques. Now, before we do this, I wanna preface it by saying this. We're not going to base our bottom hand, which means our front leg, our leading leg, those hamstrings are going to be really working in a stretched position. Now that's what we're looking to do in this pose. That's the intention of not basing on the bottom hand. But I want to say this, it can be a lot for the hamstrings. So if you have a hamstring injury or a little bit more vulnerability in that region, I don't know that I would advise this version of the pose. To enter, we're gonna do the same thing we did to enter the first pose. The entrance to all versions of triangle pose are gonna be the same. We're gonna start by rotating our hips towards the front leg instead of away from the back leg. Once we do that, we're gonna tilt our pelvis forward like we're just doing a standard forward bend. And you're gonna see, just like the last version, you and your students are gonna be able to go much lower and much deeper because the hip isn't getting stuck by having an impossible movement for it to make. Then instead of basing that bottom hand, we're gonna hover it. We can hover it just above the ground. We can hover it above the shin. We can kind of place it against the inside of the shin. Or if we're really looking for maximal demand, we can even reach that bottom arm diagonally away from us, extending the line of the bottom waist. As we do this, we're also going to rotate our pelvis and our torso away from the front leg. So we're turning them upward, just like we always do in the posture. Now, because your bottom hand's not on the floor, there's a lot of weight on the front leg. So your hamstrings are having to work to hold your body weight up while they're in a stretched position. This is an eccentric demand for the hamstrings. In order to get the core to work, especially the obliques, we wanna make sure the top ribs aren't rounding towards the ceiling. So what I like to do, I like to take my thumb onto the top ribs and my fingers on that same side outer hip and create the action of gently pinching them together, gently drawing them together. Or I imagine those top ribs are pulling down into the top hip, almost like I'm sliding my top ribs into the hip pocket. As we do this, we're working our top obliques really strongly in a good, short, concentric manner. I'm usually only in this pose for a couple of breaths. Then to come out, I bend the front knee, transition all the way up to warrior two, or bend the front knee, take the hands to the floor, and transition into a flow. The final version of triangle pose focuses on and embellishes a side bend on the top waist. Everybody, this is such a good overlooked version of this posture. In order to access it, we're gonna do the exact same thing that we did to set up the first two versions. We're gonna start with a warrior two-like length stride. We're gonna straighten the front leg, and instead of turning the hips away from the front leg, we're gonna turn them a little bit towards the front leg. Now again, just as a clarification on this hip rotation, we don't need to completely rotate the hips as far towards the front leg as we can. We're eventually going to turn the hips away from the front leg anyways. But turning the hips at least a little bit towards the front leg instead of maximally away from the front leg is gonna be incredibly beneficial in the transition. So now that I've done this, I've turned my hips at least a little bit towards the front leg, I've tilted my pelvic rim forward, and like the first version of the pose, I'm taking my bottom hand to a base. That might be the floor, it might be a block, it might be my shin. So I base on my bottom hand, I keep my top hip a little bit turned down, so I'm not maximally turning that top hip up. I want the top hip rotated down a little bit more than in the previous versions of the pose. And as I look at the front foot, I reach my arm towards it. As I reach my arm towards it, I intentionally shorten my bottom waist. So I gently draw my bottom ribs towards my bottom hip, and I let my top ribs, unlike the last version of the pose, round. As I round my top ribs, I keep reaching my top hand towards my front foot. Now, depending on your flexibility, your top arm might be reaching in free space. Your top arm might catch the front shin, in which case you have a nice little leverage, or your top arm might even reach the foot itself. The goal isn't with that top arm to hold something. Don't worry about where it goes. The goal is to have a nice side stretch. And when we do this side stretch, everybody, because we're really getting deep into the side body, we're not trying to turn up quite as much. This is almost going to be a hybrid position between a conventional triangle pose where you are more laterally rotated away from the front leg and a forward bend where you're more laterally rotated towards the front leg. From here, we take a couple of breaths, breathing into the stretch on those side ribs and into that waist, right? For some people, we might even bend the bottom elbow a little bit more, go a little deeper. This version of the pose is going to be a little heavier and a little lower into the front leg than the other versions. We're not quite as buoyant. It's almost a little bit more like a seated side bend than it is like a big standing pose. Then after that, we can nice and slowly bend the front knee and come all the way up out of the pose. I said at the beginning that I want this conversation to really do two things. Give you 3 different really good versions of triangle pose to practice and teach right away, check. But the other thing to me deep down is more important, which is to help us push back against rigid, ideological, dogmatic, black and white thinking. And again, this doesn't mean that technique doesn't matter. Of course it matters. It doesn't mean that alignment doesn't matter. Of course it matters. But the reality is technique and alignment are at least a little bit dependent on the body that's doing them and the intentions of why we are doing that pose. And the reality is we're in an era where we just see through the idea that there's a singular way for everyone to do everything in perpetuity. And in a way, I know that's difficult. I know as a yoga teacher that life would be a lot easier for me if there was one single truth that was the verified universal way for everyone to do everything in perpetuity. That would be so much easier. But it isn't the truth. I have too much experience on the yoga mat and teaching to think that that is the case. And to me, this is one of the main reasons that education is so important as practitioners and teachers. And critical thinking skills are so important for practitioners and teachers because it helps us open up possibility. It really does. It really helps us open up possibility and continue to be more agile, more thoughtful, and more skillful in the way we do what we do, both on the mat and off the mat. As always, I really appreciate you being here. Please like, subscribe, all that thing. It's really helpful for me. Also, if you want to study more with me, get to work with me directly, be part of an amazing community of students, there's plenty of ways to do that. Just go ahead and check the links below, and I'll see you soon.